Imagine living in a cramped room, barely big enough for a bed, yet handing over £2,500 every month to a landlord who never actually owns the building. That paradox sits at the heart of what we call shadow landlords, and it's turning London's housing market into a trap for millions of tenants. In the next few minutes, we'll uncover who these hidden investors are, why they have flourished in the capital, and what you can do to protect yourself before you get caught in their web. If you've ever felt stuck in a London flat, smash that like button. It tells the algorithm we're tackling a real problem together. So, what exactly is a shadow landlord? Simply put, it's an investor or a company that rents out a property they don't own. They might lease a whole block from a building owner, then sublet individual rooms or apartments at a higher price. Sometimes they operate through short-term license agreements that dodge the usual tenant protections. The result is a profit margin built on the rent gap, paying £1,800 to the actual owner while charging £2,500 to the tenant. Why has this model exploded in recent years? After the pandemic, demand for rental homes in London surged dramatically while mortgage rates tightened and buying a home became increasingly out of reach for many. At the same time, platforms that specialize in short-term lets and buy-to-let investments grew exponentially, making it easy for overseas funds and corporate investors to enter the market with minimal oversight. A quick glance at the rental price index shows a steady climb from 1999 to 2023, with a particularly sharp rise in the last 3 years. The impact on tenants is stark. Rents are inflated well beyond market rates, tenancies are insecure, and illegal evictions have become more common. He spoke with a tenant who described her experience as a nightmare. She received a 30-day notice to leave, only to discover the agreement she signed was a license, not a tenancy, leaving her with little legal protection. Stories like hers are becoming all too familiar across the city. Now, let's follow the hidden supply chain that fuels this phenomenon. Picture a flowchart. An overseas investment fund purchases a building, then hires a property management company. That company signs a lease-to-let contract with the building owner, securing the right to let the units. From there, they sublet to individual renters, often using license agreements that sidestep the Housing Act. This chain creates layers of separation that make it difficult for tenants to know who is actually in charge. The profit model is brutally simple. Suppose the management company pays £1,800 to the building owner each month for a particular flat. They then charge the tenant £2,500. That leaves a profit of £700 per month before any maintenance or administrative costs. Multiply that across dozens of units and the revenue climbs into the millions annually. The use of license agreements also means they can terminate a tenancy with as little as 30 days notice, keeping the turnover high and the cash flow steady. Why do these operators stay hidden? Because licenses are not registered with local councils in the same way tenancies are, and they fall outside many of the standard landlord and tenant regulations. This loophole allows them to avoid inspections, safety checks, and the obligations that come with being a registered landlord. As a result, many tenants never even realize they are dealing with a shadow landlord until they face an abrupt eviction or a sudden rent hike. What can you do if you suspect you're dealing with a shadow landlord? First, always ask for a clear tenancy agreement and verify whether the document is a license or a tenancy. Look for language that mentions license to occupy rather than assured short-hold tenancy. Second, check the property's title records. You can do this online through the land registry to see who actually owns the building. Finally, if you're ever served a short notice eviction, seek legal advice immediately. A solicitor can often challenge the termination if the proper procedures weren't followed. We want to hear from you now. Have you ever rented a place that felt like a ghost house, where the landlord seemed invisible? Drop a comment with the word ghost and share your story. The most compelling experiences will be featured in a future video. If this information is opening your eyes, hit that subscribe button and let's keep exploring together. The next part will dive into the legal loopholes that allow these shadow landlords to operate with impunity, and we'll look at real-world case studies that illustrate the human cost of this hidden industry. Stay tuned. The legal framework that should protect renters is riddled with cracks that shadow landlords exploit with almost surgical precision. First, it is essential to understand the distinction between a tenancy and a license, because the law treats them as fundamentally different relationships. A tenancy creates a legally recognized estate in land. It gives the occupant a protected interest that can only be ended through a formal possession order after a court hearing. A license, on the other hand, is merely permission to occupy a property for a limited time, and it can be withdrawn with a short written notice, often as little as 30 days, without the need for a court process. This subtle semantic shift is the gateway that allows shadow landlords to bypass the strict regulations that apply to registered landlords, such as mandatory safety inspections, deposit protection schemes, and the requirement to belong to an accredited tenancy deposit scheme. The Housing Act of 2012 introduced the concept of license agreements as a way to accommodate certain short-term arrangements, but it never anticipated the scale at which they would be used as a tool for profit-driven subletting. When a property is let under a license, local councils are not automatically notified, meaning the building does not appear on the council's register of houses in multiple occupation, even if it effectively functions as one. This absence from the register removes the trigger for routine health and safety checks, fire risk assessments, and the enforcement of minimum space standards. In practice, a building that houses 10 separate units, each occupied under a license, can operate in a legal gray zone, where the usual safeguards simply do not apply. Another loophole lies in the right to manage provisions that allow leaseholders to take over the management of their block without becoming outright owners. Some investment firms acquire the freehold of a building, then sell the individual flats to leaseholders while retaining the management contract. The management company, often owned by the same investment group, continues to collect service charges and, crucially, can sublet communal spaces or even entire flats under license terms. Because the leaseholders are technically owners of their units, the management company can argue that it is merely providing a service, not acting as a landlord. This legal fiction further obscures the true chain of accountability. The most recent policy development, the Renters Reform Bill, promises to overhaul many aspects of the rental market, but it deliberately excludes license-based arrangements from its scope. While the bill seeks to introduce lifetime deposits and a new private landlord register, it falls short of addressing the core issue, the ability of an entity to profit from a property without ever being recorded as a landlord. As a result, shadow landlords remain insulated from the very reforms that aim to protect tenants. To illustrate how these legal nuances translate into everyday hardship, let's walk through 3 vivid case studies that capture the human cost of this hidden industry. The first story concerns a young professional named Maya who moved to the capital for a graduate program. She found a sleek studio advertised on a popular short-term rental platform, priced at £2,300 per month. The listing promised flexible leases to occupy and highlighted a no deposit required policy, which seemed like a dream for a newcomer with limited savings. After signing a license agreement, Maya moved in and discovered that the studio was barely big enough for a single bed and a small desk. Within 3 months, the license holder sent her a notice stating that the license would be terminated in 30 days because the property was being repurposed for a higher value lease. Maya, who had already paid a non-refundable upfront fee, was left scrambling for a new home while the landlord refused to return any of the money, arguing that the license gave them full discretion to end the arrangement at any time. Maya's experience underscores how the license model strips tenants of any real security, leaving them vulnerable to abrupt displacement and financial loss. The second case involves a family of 4 living in a converted Victorian townhouse that had been subdivided into 6 separate units. The building was owned by an overseas investment fund that never registered the property as a house in multiple occupation because each unit was let under a license. The family paid an inflated rent of £1,800 per month for a 2-bedroom unit, while the fund collected a total of over £100,000 annually from all 6 licenses. When the family raised concerns about a faulty boiler and a leaking roof, the license holder dismissed the complaints, citing that the license did not impose any maintenance obligations on them. The family was forced to live without hot water for weeks, and when they finally threatened legal action, the fund responded with a 30-day termination notice, claiming the license could be ended without cause. The family's struggle highlights how the absence of statutory landlord duties leaves tenants with little recourse when essential repairs are ignored. The third narrative follows an elderly gentleman named Peter, who had lived in the same flat for over 10 years under a traditional assured short-hold tenancy. When the building's freehold was sold to a corporate entity, the new owners restructured the tenancy into a license, offering Peter a new flexible arrangement in exchange for a modest increase in rent. Peter, unfamiliar with the legal terminology, signed the license without fully understanding that his protected tenancy rights had vanished. 6 months later, the license holder invoked a clause that allowed them to terminate the license if the property was to be redeveloped. Peter received a short-notice eviction notice, and despite his long-standing occupancy, the court deemed the license a non-tenancy, meaning the usual safeguard of a possession order was not applicable. Peter was forced out with only a few weeks to find alternative accommodation, a process that proved extraordinarily stressful given his age and limited mobility. This example demonstrates how even long-term tenants can be stripped of their rights through a simple reclassification of their agreement. These stories are not isolated anomalies. They represent a growing pattern where the legal machinery is used to sidestep tenant protections. The profit margins for shadow landlords are substantial. By purchasing a property for £100 million, then leasing it out under multiple licenses at a combined rent of over £200,000 per year, they can generate a cash flow that dwarfs the cost of the mortgage, maintenance, and any management fees. The license model also reduces the administrative burden because there is no need to register each tenant with a deposit scheme, no requirement for annual gas safety certificates, and no obligation to provide an energy performance certificate. This streamlined approach maximizes profit while minimizing regulatory exposure. If you suspect you are dealing with a shadow landlord, there are practical steps you can take right now to protect yourself. Start by requesting a copy of the agreement and scrutinize the language. Look for phrases such as license to occupy or license agreement, rather than the more familiar assured short-hold tenancy. If you see those terms, ask the landlord to clarify whether they are a registered landlord with a deposit protection scheme. Next, verify the ownership of the property through the land registry, which is accessible online for a modest fee. Knowing who holds the freehold or leasehold will give you insight into whether the party you are paying actually has ownership rights or is merely acting as an intermediary. Additionally, check whether the property is listed on the local council's register of houses in multiple occupation. If it is not, that could be a red flag indicating that the landlord is operating under a licensed structure to avoid inspection. Should you receive a short notice eviction, do not ignore it. Even though a license can be terminated with limited notice, the termination must still be carried out in accordance with the terms set out in the agreement, and any unfair or discriminatory notice can be challenged. Contact a housing solicitor or a local advice center as soon as possible. Many charities offer free initial consultations. In some cases, the solicitor can argue that the license was effectively a tenancy, especially if the occupant has exclusive possession of a defined part of the property and pays a regular rent, which are hallmarks of a tenancy under common law. If the court agrees, the landlord would then be required to follow the full possession procedure, giving you more time and potentially the right to remain. Another protective measure is to join a tenants' union or a local renters association. These groups often have collective bargaining power, can provide legal support, and keep members informed about the latest policy changes and enforcement actions. By sharing experiences and resources, tenants can create a network that makes it harder for shadow landlords to operate in isolation. It is also worth keeping an eye on upcoming legislative developments. While the Renters Reform Bill does not directly address licenses, there is growing pressure from advocacy groups to amend the bill to include license arrangements within the new landlord register and to extend deposit protection to all occupants, regardless of the contract label. If you are passionate about housing justice, consider reaching out to your local MP or participating in public consultations when they are opened. Grassroots advocacy can be a powerful catalyst for change, especially when it is backed by real-world stories like the ones we have discussed.
The time has
Now
come
that
to
we have
rise
unpacked
up!
the legal scaffolding that enables shadow landlords to thrive, let's turn our attention to the broader societal impact. When a significant portion of the rental market is dominated by entities that can evict with minimal notice, the stability of entire neighborhoods is undermined. Frequent turnover erodes community ties, reduces the sense of belonging, and can lead to a rise in short-term, high-turnover accommodation that feels more like a hotel than a home. This instability also has knock-on effects for local businesses, schools, and health services which rely on a stable resident base to plan and allocate resources effectively. Moreover, the hidden nature of these arrangements makes it difficult for policymakers to gather accurate data on the true size of the private rental sector. If licenses are not recorded, the official statistics will underreport the number of occupied units, leading to misinformed decisions about housing supply, rent control measures, and social housing funding. In other words, the very invisibility that benefits shadow landlords also blinds the public sector, perpetuating a cycle where the problem remains unaddressed.